as we go along. Also then, I'd like you to keep thinking about, on your own part, your own life, what you begin to feel you might do with the information that I'm finding you can do things more efficiently, more effectively. What could you do to contribute to the total evolution of humanity and getting him ready for to operate competently in a high function in the universe by helping him, each individual, to a higher advantage, to be more efficient, to be spontaneously more efficient, make it logical to be more efficient, to be enjoyable to be more efficient. The more we really learn about big patterns, then the more comprehensive we are, and the more we learn how these patterns operate, the more we can really anticipate how we could take advantage of the principles that are operative to bring them to advantage of humanity, to try to make humanity a success, trying to make the whole ecological system a success, to begin to participate in what apparently nature is always doing, eternally regenerating. So I find I have to use these words: comprehensive, anticipatory, design, science. I gave you science as setting order the facts of experience. I gave you design as against the happening to you, where you do it deliberately, where using principles then, employing order, we try to anticipate the needs of humanity, anticipate the needs of nature in general, try to anticipate the accommodation of the total intercomplementarity. And using these principles then to actually begin to participate in the evolutionary formulations of nature, where we don't just have to take it for granted that somebody else is going to provide these things for us, somebody going to invent. That each one of us has then an increasing intuition of an obligation to employ these principles in an effective manner on behalf of all of humanity and on behalf of the total integrity of the universe itself in its eternal regeneration. Now, I am obviously deliberately thinking about my strategies, and I'm operating entirely intuitively and spontaneously. And I'm really looking around to see if there's anything that I feel that just small points to make before going to another large scene. I'm now going to do a little reviewing of, as I did yesterday, what is it that I'm conscious of when I say I'm thinking. I'm now going to come down to, I said, if we try to find one word, just one word alone, that identifies our experience of a phenomena called life, I'd say the number one word would be awareness. And I then also say no otherness, no awareness. There has to be something to be aware of. I find this very, very fundamental, and it relates very much to the complementarity. And the otherness would be not exactly the same. It could bring about a tendency to differentiate as observer from the observed. I find it fascinating to think about awareness and say, no otherness, there's nothing to look at, there's nothing to sense. So there would be no life under those circumstances. I want to think about a rather simple model here of I'm going to have an entity, and I'm going to make it a spherical entity. At the moment, it's an islanded entity, and there's no aberration of force operating on it, so it tends to be spherical. And there is otherness, but it's for the moment not aware of it. Gradually, suddenly, there's mass into attractiveness, and then anotherness that gets attracted. So we have another sphere being pulled towards the sphere. And there's this sort of aware that something is different in light that you're experiencing. There's something going on here. I think it'll be differential. There's no shadow or anything for the moment, because I don't have any source of light. But this otherness and is mass attracted, because the two spheres trying to come as close as they can together, the tangent, they begin to roll around in one another. It seems, if you and I could see this from a distance, they would look like a dumbbell. There's just two spheres tangent. You would not know whether they're rolling on each other or not. But you and I know if we take two spheres and put that, they just can roll around each other very, very readily. Now, a third otherness is in the universe, and it gets attracted to the first two. And it is a third sphere, and it comes in. I just take a couple of spheres here to get this feeling. Just want to get a feel of these, how they can roll around on each other. And now there's a third sphere that gets attracted. And it comes to touches one of these and begins to roll around on it, and it gets into the valley between the two. Now it's suddenly equally attracted by both of them. And suddenly we have a triangle. And triangle, remember, has basic structure. So this has extraordinary stability. No longer can they roll anywhere around here, because we found, I'm sure you've had experience with gears. You got two gears of the same diameter, same number of teeth, and you have one turning clockwise and they meshed, and the other one's turning counterclockwise. They go along very nicely. If we have four gears, touching the train of gears are called, positive, a negative, everything just goes great. But if I have odd numbers of gears, 3 for instance, these two can be going like that. But then the one that comes and touches here can't gratify both directions, going this way and that way, and they lock. When we have odd numbers of gears in a train, they lock. So we find these 3 spheres can no longer just roll around here, but the one thing they can do, notice this one touches 2 others here. So it can roll in that valley like that, rolling around here. What happens is that if this one does something, there's a friction here and makes the other one do it. So we find all 3 of them begin to, like a rubber donut, they evolve like that. They can do that very well. So the top is evolving outwardly and the bottom is turning inwardly. So that's just called kind of like a rubber donut can keep going around. Now a 4th sphere appears in the universe, and it doesn't make a difference exactly what size it is. And it lands on here and rolls around here and gets this valley, and then suddenly goes in the nest between the others. And once that 4th one is there, it locks it so it can no longer evolute involute. So suddenly we find the 4th sphere is making the tetrahedron again, and suddenly it is structurally stable as the 4 interact to offset any other freedoms of motion here. Just fun. I was asked about 8 years ago to go to the University of California at Los Angeles, where they're having the art departments of all of the University of California branches along the coast annually choose one of them where they'll have an art festival they all come together at. I was asked to the art festival in Los Angeles, and they asked me, after having had a lecture, they want to have a happening. So we went into, they got a big field house, and I brought a great many spheres, the styrofoam spheres, skewers, toothpicks, and rope string. And I started by having this in university. It doesn't see any other than this. It doesn't even know what it's doing. It's running around. I was running around the floor of this thing like this with one of the balls. And then the other one appears, and they get together and had three, and then four of them locked together. There was a little child of a couple over the floor, about 2 years old. And this child saw me do this and ran out from her parents out on the floor, and I was running around all these balls. And the little child started picking them up and doing exactly the same things. It was really very interesting. This little 2-year-old had found just what I was doing to be just the way his own curiosity made it behave. And after the show was over, NBC had a team of cameramen and directors and so forth, and they said, we've been waiting till this is over, so we want to make a movie picture of you. And I said, did you take that picture, the episode of that little child? I said, of course not. And I said, well, you can't make any picture of me. Just to give you an idea of my feeling about recordings, because I do care about the live and the way things really do happen, and I care a great deal about the way things go on in this room right here now. Now I'm going to point out that I was dealing here in spheres, and when I did the tetrahedron before, I had some points, and the 4 points had inter-attractiveness, and they did give me a system. They defined an insideness and outsideness. But we really come out things a little different way here. And then I can also, finding there's really sort of fundamental two-ness, I could really have had this sphere and this sphere could interconnect, and this sphere could interconnect. And these spheres are just a little too large for my hands. That's the trouble. I'm going to have to now I take two spheres and two spheres. They're touching each other, the pairs, dumbbells. What I want to do is to bring them together, not to make a square, but we have precession. The interpull makes this precess, actually makes it rotate 90 degrees, and suddenly these two then nest on these two. And as you look at the tetrahedron made of, you've got two pairs of spheres, and there's a positive and a negative pair. They really do this to each other. And they do this precession, and we'll learn later on that this is very important, this precessional association, things come together rotatively like that. Now, I'm going to also then come back to something I did talk a little about yesterday, the 6 edges of the tetrahedron as acting, the 6 represented one unit of quantum, these 6 vectors. And I made an experiment with my own personal body in relation to degrees of freedom. Being brought up in a good community, I'm in a good school, and I learned considerable about physics and so forth, chemistry. I was very intrigued by the concept of the inter-attractiveness of the masses and so forth. And I said, also as I got into navigation in the Navy, if I'm looking at something like the Pleiades or looking at Andromeda, it's approximately just one little point. But you learn that that's a whole constellation. You're looking at incredible numbers of stars. But they're so far away that they appear to be one star. and thinking about then mass inter-attraction. So what I said, if they're pulling me, I don't think each of those stars separately, a billion stars in there are pulling on me separately. They really would be, they're so far away that parallax sets in and they really, in fact, only one pull. We do have then in astronomy this phenomenon of parallax, and then it's continually operative where things do pair together. So I said, I wonder how many lines are pulling on me in the universe. Though it's pulling on our Earth a little more so, but how many are pulling on me, or even, say, pulling on our Earth? Are they, each one of those stars, they're pulling separately, or do they group up, possibly, into pulls? And due to the fact that they're non-simultaneous, possibly the interpullings do integrate in some extraordinary kind of timing way of coming from different periods of time. So I said, let me think about, I'm going to look at those stars, and I look out, can I see a hole in the stars, some place where it looked like if I accelerate, I might go out and get away from all the stars, and I go further and further away from all the stars, and they finally just look like one. But there still would be mass inter-attraction. So I would be very much as if like a ball on a string. Like we call it a tether ball. We have a mast and a string and a tennis ball on there, and you can hit it. And that ball can go all kinds of ways. But the one thing it can do is get away from the universe. So there's just one restraint on us. But you can find it could make all kinds of shapes, spheres, all kinds, describe anything. Yeah. And I'm going to say, I don't think, experience doesn't suggest to me that we really will find a hole through those stars, because I find when I get to 1 billion times 100 billion stars that surround us, that we now know of already. If I were to take the numbers of atoms in this room surrounding me, it'd be, and there's pretty thick walls, to get into that kind of number. So that I probably wouldn't find any hole on those stars. So much more likely that I might be able to take all the stars in the heavens and divide it, like looking, there is the Milky Way. I might take 2 halves of all the stars and sort of divide them into 2 teams, so they pulled on me kind of evenly. So I took my ball that had a string and I put another string on it. And I fastened, got you to take a hold of one and I take the other. And so the ball's in the middle of it. It's like a ball in the middle of a violin string. It could still move, but it can only move in a plane. You can make figures of 8 and clover leaves and so forth, but in a plane. So I said, I don't think I really can divide the stars up evenly that way. And more probably, I have to get more teams. I'm going to take 3 pulls on me. So I took a 3rd string on this the ball is the middle between you and I. You take the 3rd string and you pull it over there. Now I find it can still move, but it's as if it's a ball in the middle of a drum head. It can oscillate only in a line. But interesting. 1 restraint allowed me to have sphericity, 2 restraints made me a plane, and 3 restraints produces a line. So then I said, I'm going to pull the drum head one way. I put a 4th line on the ball, pull it vertically, and it suddenly seems to be immobilized, as if I muted the drum. Pulling the skin just one direction. But I made a model where I made a steel tetrahedron with 4 corners and had the 4 rods, thin steel rods, come into a central ball at the center of the center of gravity of the tetrahedron. And the steel ball, and I pulled those rods tight. They were very thin, so the slenderness ratio. And I found that the ball, if I put a plumber's Stilson wrench on that ball, I could rotate it in place. I could not move it away from any of the 4 corners, but locally you could rotate. In fact, put it on several ways and kept rotating. So it was locally rotatable. Why? Because you found that any 2 of these rods were coming into the surface of the sphere. They were not coming to the center of the sphere. You couldn't get the center of the sphere. You're bound as long as there's in a sphere there tall. You want one coming like that and one in here, so it made a trapezoid. There was a distance between where they hit the sphere. And a trapezoid is unstable as a 4-sided figure. So I found that in order to stop it from doing any rotating like that locally, I had to take each of the 4 rods that came in and turn each one into 3 rods from 4 corners, and each one had to come in, the 3 came in tangentially, making in effect 4 tetrahedra coming in tangentially. And then for the first time it could not move. So sum total they found 12 rods were necessary to completely to eliminate all degrees of freedom. I wanted to confirm that in another way, so I then began to think about a bicycle and a bicycle wheel. And bicycle wheels are fascinating because bicycle wheels manifest man getting into tensegrity in his structures. The old-fashioned solid wooden wheel, that's just a number of plates brought together like that, one thing. Then we began to get what we call artillery wheels. You found you could put holes in the solid wheel. Then instead of having those holes, you could deliberately have columns, a series of columns running between the outer rim and the hub. And the columns had to be then what we call a stout column, a short column, so they not get in the critical slenderness ratio, or they're bent. So each one is a pole, like pole vaulting, as you go vault over the bar, they give you another bar, and they keep going along on these columns. Then we came the wire wheel, and the wire wheel is very different because the load is the wagon, and the wagon then goes out to its spindles here in the hubs, and you want to support then at the hub. The wheel is there to do that. So in a wire wheel, you hang the load by a thin wire, which would otherwise bend if any compression on it, but you hang the load from the top of the wheel down to the hub. So if there was just one spoke, as the wheel went along, then you suddenly the whole thing would crash. We find then if you want to have your bicycle wheel worthwhile light, you have an awful lot of weight to pump as you pump your bicycle, so you'd like to have the wheel weigh as little as possible, so you'd like to have the rim good and thin. And the rim is a mass, it's over a bent mass going around, coming back to itself, so that what I want to do is to shorten up the unsupported length of rim. So I'm going to have a hub and one tension from the top down to the hub, and then go 120 degrees on the wheel and have another spoke over here, another. So we've got three spokes now. They're just wire spokes to the hub. Well, I find they act like that drum head. They'll oscillate. The whole thing will oscillate in the wheel and completely unstable and unsteerable. So that won't do. So I see what I could do is if I had two skins on a drum head, and I put a spacer in between the two, then you mute it, you can put it positive and negative, so I could have 6 spokes now, and 3 come from one side of the hub, of the rim, into the hub, and 3 from the other side. So the 3 emanating from the end of the hub, but instead of having like this, have it turned like that. So they then have shorter sections of unsupported rim to stabilize it. But I found that didn't work, because as the 6 came into the hub, again they came in the way I shown you the circle before. They came in forming a trapezoid, so there's a little section here, and the hub could torque it locally. I found I had to take each of the 6 came in there, and break each one into 2, and have each one come in the pairs tangentially. One take care of the rotation this way, and one take care of the rotation that way. Now it is perfectly possible to put, of those 6, that I could only take 2 of them and cross them to take care of this torque, you say. But then you find if you do, you unbalance this. The wheel has to have symmetry of structuring all the way through, and if you have an oddity like just one pair across to top this, then you find that she's going to wobble like that. She builds up what you call dynamic instability. So that it takes a minimum of 12 spokes for a wire wheel. It took a minimum of 12 restraints to immobilize me in the universe. So I find then these seem to be the 6 positive and the 6 negative of the same, our old friend, the tetrahedron. So the tetrahedron then can, as we saw it yesterday, can turn itself inside out, and so then this is the positive and the negative side of the same tetrahedron. I gave you yesterday the dimpling in of the that this tetrahedron can turn itself inside out if it's rubber legs. If I just move one vertex just one vertex I had to move, so the legs are rubbery, will do that. Then we looked at the octahedron and found the octahedron simply one half it nested back in the other half, and the icosahedron there was a local dimpling. As we get to even larger numbers of could I have that sphere, please? I get to higher and higher frequency of triangular subdivision going beyond the icosahedron, which this does. Then you find this gets to be what I call local dimpling, and the higher the frequency, the more local the dimpling. So we begin to understand then the tetrahedron turns out completely inside out, and here we're going to having less and less effect as you get the positive and the negative here of the dimpling. Now, I want you to think in largest possible context of our universe, and our universe which is continually transforming everywhere, but everywhere transforming at different rates. And I gave you the importing, exporting of energies of the Boltzmann effect, where energies given off by this begin to form new, and there get to be new local systems in the universe, new stars, and then they begin to gradually get to the point where, instead of being, I use the word syntropic, in contradistinction to great second law of thermodynamics, entropic, where they're giving off energies. They're places where energies are being imported, and not only imported but sought in and put into increasing order. And now thinking about things in a very big kind of pattern, and thinking about our own what it is you and I are experiencing. Recalling that yes, a year ago we had the Copernicus celebration of the 500th year, since he realized that we were also on a planet. We're not in a platform in the middle of the universe, everything going around us. We come then to the realization of the little planet. There really is, and this is very important for you, theoretically, we now know then this is a little planet of the sun, and many things that I talk about, very familiar to all of you. This is the well-known data. But I want to point out to you that also then there are these conditioned reflexes of humanity, where what we've had explanations from people who love us very much, we love them very much, and we get to being told by people who love us very much, you're going to find this very pleasant and so forth, it's going to be bad, developing all kinds of prejudices and so forth, and fixities of reflexing. I have tried, I've had the advantage of speaking to bodies of distinguished scientists on a number of occasions, and I've always asked those scientists if any of them can raise his hand and say, I do not, when most people say they see the sun setting, that they do not see the sun setting, that they see and feel the horizon of the earth to be rolling around to obscure the sun. All of them agree that they see the sun setting. And we all agree that science has known for 500 years that that's not what's going on. So I want to point out there's a complete difference between the theoretical knowledge that you have. So science and all society has greater theoretical knowledge, but the sensing is the way they reflex. And they've been told and conditioned for a very, very long time that the sun is going around the earth. And they also were thinking of they noticed a sphere today, but find humanity still talking and thinking flat Earth. It still uses wide world. It's to each local person, it's still really feeling this is a flat out here. And there's some I know the people out in China are not upside down, but the point is, I feel this way. And because of it's a flat, it goes to infinity, therefore what goes on locally is very important, and there's room to get rid of anything you don't like, and man's been operating that kind of way. There's also been part of his experience of dealing infinity. Infinity is going to have a lot more resources to take the place of the ones you've already wasted and used up. Man's been very tightly tied up to those conditioned reflexes. And as you begin to go along with me during these few days here together, I want you to always be deeply aware of those conditioned reflexes that are working against the man's taking advantage of the theoretical knowledge we have, because I've been going to expose you to more and more discoveries of principles that are operative that could make it possible to make a man a great success, because I really have now taken inventory totally of how much you need to have environmental control. We've taken inventory of how much energy we need to really carry on, having all of humanity enjoying all the earth, continually looking out for all the generations to come, and we find it highly feasible. But we see that humanity is tied up in patterns that do not make it very clear whether they're really going to break through, whether they're going to overcome the conditioned reflexes. Maybe there's a great many older people going to have to die before we really free ourselves. Maybe that's the evolutionary rate. We find nature does have her checks and balances, and she has gestation rates. She doesn't have any immediate anything. And each one has, and the bigger ones take the longer. The most important ones take the longest. So that what is going the biggest way is you and I are trying to be as conscious as we can about how we participate and what are the challenges to our employing this information on behalf of the others. Now, in this kind of a big patterning, I want today to try to think about something I've mentioned 2 or 3 times, how and why human beings are here, why we're designed the way we are, why the biosphere and the greater ecology system is designed the way it is, and why this little tiny planet with all this great complexity on board of it is present in our universe, and why the invisible you and I are an incredible complex of beautiful technology. And that's a point that you might as well think about now and think about all through my talk, that technology is then the integrity of interrelationship, interoperativeness of principles, and the ability to accommodate the transformations, and the ability to complement and to it is a great enormous complexity of interaction of generalized principles which make possible an eternally regenerative universe, where the principles are then always characterized by these degrees of freedom, with now known 92 regenerative chemical elements, and having discovered just in this century that each one of those chemical elements, when incandescent, we said yesterday, has a unique set of frequencies, electromagnetic frequencies they give off. These are invisible colors to you and I, invisible frequencies that we don't have the tuning capability for, but they are tunable and recognizable by photographic emulsions, so that we have been able then to identify each one of them. And we have then these incredible behaviors of incredibly high frequencies, way beyond any sensing on your part and my part. And with every one of the events of the intertransformings, there are always 6 positive, 6 negative degrees of freedom. There are an enormous number of options of nature. Because I want you to just think about that pattern. I said with every event, there are always these 6 positive, 6 negative. If I were to make a drawing of that then, this is a game of chess but it's an omnidirectional game of chess, and every time you get a move, you get 6 moves. And it's going to be in respect to an orderly universe. But so you have this move, and you can go like that, you can go like that, and come back where you started, because you had 6. Or you could, same 6, you can go like that, that. It might be over here. There are an extraordinary number of varieties of consequences. With every move, you go 6, and they're not in a plane, because they can also then be this way. As a consequence of the universe, having these 6 positive, 6 negative degrees of freedom with every move, we have differentiation and positioning. And the very fact that there is differential interpositioning and entities in our sensing is accommodated by this. It means then there's so many of the varieties and options of choice. These are equi-economical, because nature is always most economical. These are most economical vectors. So there's 6 positive, 6 negative, equi-economical options at every event. So it's anything but a yes, no, stop, go. Man tends to think linearly that he's going to get chopped on a red light or a green light. But it's not that way at all. It has so many degrees of freedom, and the frequency at which the next move comes is so high that you can come out daisies, you can come out elephants, you can come out galaxies. This to me is incredible that it has so much freedom. There seems to be absolutely free. There's a tendency of man then talking about sort of a free will, but he does have all his physical options. He in effect can do anything, but some of the things will take longer than others. In effect, he can do anything, but they just take longer than others. Now, here are we human beings in this kind of a pattern, and with the minds discovering those principles and discovering that there's a plurality and they're all interaccommodative, and that a plurality of interaccommodative behaviors are designed, that we human beings discovered that we're given the faculty to have access to some of the design of the universe itself, that we don't know any other phenomena having this capability, makes me have to really pay a lot of attention to that human being here. I want to think a little more about those human beings. What do we know about them in relation to other living species? All other enormous number of organisms, botanical and zoological. And one thing I can say is the following, that all the other species have an evidence, very important integral equipment built into the organism, which gives special advantage in special environments. So maybe this particular kind of a vine that grows superbly in this particular area of the Amazon, or some kind of insect could do just extraordinary little things locally on special environments. There's just special equipment for it. So there's a very strange-looking creature can have that special equipment. So we find the bird then designed with integral wings. For his métier then is the air. In gases he can fly beautifully. But when he's not flying, he cannot divest himself of his wings. So the wings then, when he's trying to walk around, are quite encumbering. We find then all living species then having some of this integral equipment for special environments. We've found a number of the creatures with brains the way human beings have, and those brains are also sensing mechanisms, and they're feeling. And the brains, as I said yesterday, always correlating and integrating the information of the different senses. And human beings have larger brains than any of the others. They can put away and store information regarding more special case experiences than the others. But then the human has that mind. We don't have any knowledge of any other creature having that kind of phenomenon. We don't find any evidence any of the creatures are deliberately employing principles. They are flying, there's low pressure, their wing is beautifully designed for them to do it, but they have not designed it that way. Now, what I find then that the humans are then given the capability to get enormous amounts of information, and this ability to discover principles, and to be really then very much at the center of things, where the individual then discovers the principle of pressure differentials in gases, Bernoulli principle, about the wing foil with the pressure difference, the negative lift. And human beings then can invent wings, and they can produce those wings using other principles and alloys and so forth. They're able then to fly, put on wings and fly many times faster than a bird, and then when they're not using the wings, to take them off and not be humbled, and let somebody else use their wings. And wings can go from generation to generation. The same organism can be used by others. In other words, they begin to develop their own organism. We are given the capability to employ principles and actually participate in some way in the evolutionary events of the universe. Because we do produce these artifacts. They do alter the environmental behaviors. But we're given that capability. Now, again, I said all universe is technology. And the technology is going on all the time, and you don't know what makes your fingernail grow, but it's beautiful technology. The fact you don't know or not familiar with that technology doesn't make it non-technology. I find human beings using the word technology today as if it's something very new and something just been introduced by man, and they find it bad simply because the technologies employed by man so far have, in the ignorance of man, thinking it has to be you or me, been used selfishly, trying to get special advantage from our side, and particularly in developing weapons for just the killing. It's been used very, very negatively. This does not mean technology is bad, because this hand can then do some very superb work, very advantageous to you and I, all the people here. I can do this terrible thing of killing and breaking. So that it's the way human beings have used the technology that has been some inadequate and fearful, powerfully conditioned reflex, misinformation that's made human beings misuse the technology. But I want to be sure we don't get caught in any trap where we say, I'm against technology or something like that, and I'm going to go back to pre-technology. You never will. As long as there's going to be a turnip growing there, that's incredible technology. And so that simply is a matter of how do we employ it. Are we really thoughtful? Are we considerate about all the other reciprocities that have to go on ecologically? Those are things. Are we considerate when they talk comprehensive anticipatory design science? We pay attention to what the universe is trying to do. Are we conserving the universe? Are we using the income energies? Are we using the permitted, or are we really trespassing and using up some of the equipment? It's a very different matter to use the energy and use the lever rather than burning the lever up in the fire. Now, next thing. Thinking about humans having these capabilities of using principles and being really the center of things, this also brings me to a very interesting realization that human beings are, being at the center is very different from being on someplace, a position on a line or in a pipe. You could not really improve on the center. And I hear people talking about possible genetics, possible bad experiments be made by scientists in trying to alter the human being. All I know is there's no way you can really improve on the center. You can, if it's linear, you can make the man go high jump a little higher. But you could not get closer to the center than the center. And really, our function is to be at the center of the information, to discover the principles and deploy those principles. That's absolutely the way we function. We're at the center. And our whole thinking is that way, this omnidirectional observation. If universe found it expedient to have human beings really specialists, she would have had them born with some have a microscope on one eye and a telescope on the other, they could get on great. But that's not, we were not meant to be that way. We were meant to be then omni-medium, omnidirection, omni-environment operative. And we've given principles then to permeate and occupy large and large environments to finally get off the board of our little tiny planets and get over to the next operating, that moon going around, the Earth like this going around the sun together, so we got a ferry cross between these fast-moving objects. We've been able to do that, and we're going to go much further. We're getting probing information much further. Quite clearly, human beings are some kind of a local universe operator with a mothership to operate from. Now, putting together all I can about all the total information I've received, I've come to the working conclusion, as Einstein did, that energies given off here reassociate there, and we have to pay attention to the fact that the physicists have no experimental evidence of energy being either created, being lost. It apparently is eternally regenerative, does go through negative and discontinuity phases and reappearing there. And we're dealing not in things anyway, where we discover we're dealing really in pure principle. Where the physicist admits that there is no particle, he is dealing in events in pure principle. And we get to where the information in the physics really gives us then positive and negative weights. And we take the total of all the weights of physics, positive and negative, they're clearly identifiable today, they all add up to zero. That we're really dealing in absolutely pure principle. And there's something goes on in the design of this universe. These principles are operative that do give seemingly positional aberration, by virtue of which there does seem to be difference of view of you and I. That each of us might be some kind of one way in which the universe may have come out, because the universe had all those options. Each one of us may be a very fast-running hand, one way of playing the game of universe. And so each thing just look a little different, each one of us. Then when I come to thinking about the thinking and about all the information we do have, I have to come to something I gave to you yesterday, that there are lags and rates of recall. Not only are there lags and rates of recall, but there are lags and rate of apprehending. You know, there's this double take. I did see something. Your senses told you something first, but then turn there and see a little more and look a third time. Sure enough, there's somebody I know. But there's lag in here. Lag in here. The fact that there is lag means we were never really right on with the extraordinary velocity of things do operate. That is, we're always a little out of phase with whatever the really great principles are themselves. That we are inherently aberrated. And that we find what begins to become very fascinating, get into synergetics and which are all the geometries that we have, that you'll be expecting with me here. And our book is just about to come out with the synergetics. Is to discover that really nature has aberrational limits, and she pulsates from the vector equilibrium. That's the absolute zero, when our aberration will never let us stay at the center. We cannot get to the pure center, but nature pulsates through the positive and negative from it into various degrees and all these different kinds of intertransformabilities with very, very high frequencies of doing it. So that what we have as an awareness is really one way of being sort of aware of the universe, really checking up in its own principles. And checking up in its own integrity of its holding together while it can aberrate. It's a really quite a fascinating piece of thinking here as we come to that kind of a challenge. Now, in big pattern, we have the Boltzmann concept of the energies exporting and importing, fortified by the Einsteinian feeling those energies are actually collected, and bring about the scenario universe of the new formulations of the dying off of the old, the comings apart and the comings together. In such a pattern, which the science, and particularly astronomers, astrophysicists, has been very aware of for a long time, they have realized, of course, that all the stars are visible to you and I optically by virtue of being entropic, all the energies they give off. So they give us high notice of their presence by virtue of giving off. Then this would mean then that where energies are being imported and collected, give off nothing. And there would be nothing for you and I to see. So we are only aware of the giving off parts, but they assume there must be collecting parts in order to have the eternal regeneration. So well, the only possibility would be we bounce something off something, but everything's such motions that by the time the information comes back, you bounce something off something that many generations have gone by, and somebody forgot to ever set something out there. But suddenly it became very interesting to realize that when you don't think of our Earth as standing still in the middle of the universe, when you really get your senses going along with your knowledge, that we are then a little collecting, we're an importing center of universe, where the sun's radiation and this other star radiation is being impounded by the photosynthesis. Just think of that extraordinary matter. The energy is given off by the sun, as we've been able to see in the most recent photographs we have from space with the least aberration of optical aberration. These extraordinary flames going out incredible distances, but enormous irregularity. And you and I on our planet just far enough away so life doesn't get dehydrated and burned up by this enormous radiation. And the radiation coming through the atmosphere, we would be burnt up if we get outside of it just nakedly, so they have to have all the spacesuits when you do go out there. But the sun radiation is then refracted and bent by the Van Allen belt and by the ionosphere, bent enormously by the atmosphere, and bent into red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, so that then we get to non-lethal concentrations. So the energy is being separated out and getting bent more by the waters of the earth. And so many bendings that finally the sun radiation, instead of being bounced off reflectively off a polished ball, getting bent, and impounded on our planet, by that energy being caught as heat and heating up the waters of the ocean. Three-quarters of the earth being covered with water, and water taking on heat and losing it, letting it off more slowly than any other substance. So this very stabilizing energy impounder of the water, stabilizing the heat operating around our Earth to such an extraordinary extent that the annual variations, as you all know, do not really add up to 1 degree Fahrenheit over very enormous periods of time. If it gets just a little variation, it works towards an ice age, a little away from the ice age. And so we find then that within this extraordinary thermal balance, all that beautiful sun radiation would say the clouds there that get in the way, so that there's great irregularity of the receipts, and you have to get bent and get in this beautiful orderly heat. Absolutely. So superbly balanced that you and I, consisting very much of the same ingredients as the sea water, that you and I, if in good health, no matter what our age, no matter what clothes we're wearing, no matter where we are geographically, if we're in good health, biparticle heat, 98 6/10 degrees Fahrenheit. That we're in an incredible energy balance. And just not only did nature make the tree hydraulically, but she makes you and I hydraulically. And so the beautiful firmness of our flesh is then that hydraulic pressure, which is non-compressible, and it distributes its load so you and I can run into all these things and not get hurt. And we're given them biparticle heat, that 98 6/10 degrees, so we won't freeze, so the load distributed can go on. And we're given just think of the delicate balance we really are in here compared to the temperatures that are operative when you get once you get outside that biosphere. Incredible piece of design. Now, finding us then impounding the sun radiation, and the vegetation impounding it for the human beings, because the human beings can't do it, the mammals can't. And what they do is to take those random receipts, because there's a cloud going by and so forth, different kind of intensities of the sun today, all those random receipts converted into beautiful, orderly molecular structures. Incredible. This is exactly the opposite of entropy. Entropy is the increase of random element, and here we are, syntropy, syntropic, I use the word sin here as I do, synergy and energy. There's syntropy and entropy. Entropy coming apart in disorderly ways, syntropy coming together in increasingly orderly ways. We apparently had a syntropic center in the universe, where then the vegetation having power made this beautiful hydrocarbon molecules, then other biologicals could take it on. They continually multiply as beautiful hydrocarbon molecules. And they get buried more and more deeply in the earth. You and I call it fossil fuels, but nature's bearing energy in extraordinarily orderly manner, such a way that as we find, you take out that petroleum, turn it into petrochemicals, you make incredible, absolute orderly controllability to come out any way in design. All this being compounded here. So we're at a syntropic center of the universe, where sometime the energies would be impounded against possibly becoming a star, and that would probably take, say, by the general records, indicate certainly another 10 billion years from now. As by this time, whatever you and I are as local information handlers, we'll probably be very remote, so it's all right for it to become a star. In the general scheme of things, the rate at which we are learning to get around this seems perfectly reasonable. Now, I want to then think about, we're on board of a syntropic center where energy is being collected, and where the energy is being, randomness is converted into orderliness by the biosphere, by everything around us. We keep turning into order. And the biological growth is to make more order, to make more orderly babies, most extraordinary organisms. The incredibility of the beauty of all those designs, whether it's the atoms or the multiplying the atoms in pure principle. And all the behavior is absolutely reliable here. Now, amongst then all the biologicals, as I said, the mammals cannot impound that sun radiation, and they can multiply the hydrocarbons and get to be pretty big and pretty fat, a big tree. Then the hydrocarbons don't get lost, even though the particular operation of that particular organism, they call it its life, meant to be there, but the hydrocarbons don't get lost. This syntropic process is really going on in an extraordinary way, making better and better topsoil here. And we find that when we get to the topsoil of our Earth, the chemical elements that are present in the topsoil are not present deep within the Earth, but we find that the 92 regenerative chemical elements, 91 of them have been found on our Earth, but most of them are near the surface of the Earth. The great large abundance of the high variety of relatively small ones are near the surface. Apparently, as star receipts from the rest of the universe. When we go through the tail of a comet, we get as much as 100,000 tons of stardust a day being deposited on our surface of Earth. So here we are at a syntropic center receiving some extraordinary inventory of equipment from the rest of the universe, and gradually discovering about principles that are operative. And amongst then all the biologicals, we cannot multiply the hydrocarbon molecules as fast as trees or elephants, but what we can do, we have this extraordinary mind. And as I said to you last night as we finished, what is common to all human beings through all history? Problem solving. We're here for problem solving. And we're able to solve it in principle, and none of the others can solve it in principle. That we have this access to that extraordinary design capability of the universe itself gives us as far as we know, by far the most powerful syntropic function in the universe. Boy, that's quite a responsibility. And that we, in our ignorance and our fear, looking out for two sides can get into the negative of trying to kill, this seems very paradoxical, but I would think quite clearly we're getting to the point where this is so paradoxical it's about to cease. In other words, I spoke to you about our all coming out of some common womb of permitted ignorance with enough cushion of resources by trial and error to make mistake after mistake, to learn what we're learning. And this is a very extraordinary moment, I find, because suddenly there is all around the world literacy. Just wasn't there when I was young. When Russia had its revolution, just yesterday, I was 22 years of age when the Russian Revolution occurred. And they were more than 90% illiterate. They couldn't get anywhere without licking that literacy, first thing. All around the world, that literacy being licked. And nobody knew we were going to have this radio and beautiful diction, and you have gradually leveling out of words. How do you say the words? So we get the common speech is just proliferating everywhere. So we have an extraordinary intercommunicability, and the rate at which we're all processing information, learning about these principles is just incredible. It was just incredible. When I was young, kids rarely got on into high school. It was very, some 1% could get them in high school. At times they had to go off to jobs. See, 1929, and by then I'm 34 years of age. They were getting where something like 1% was getting into the high school and going on and graduating from high school. There was a very small percentage getting to college. This all changed. We're getting where everybody is entitled to go in and get all through the school and get into college, get a PhD. It's absolutely new moment of man on our planet. You used to say, you're going to have to go to work just as soon as you can stand up down. And then when I was young, there was still, in many places in the world, kids are going to work in the mines at 6, are going to work in the mills at 6 age. This is all changing. Now, just in my lifetime, we doubled life expectancy. All the things have been said that are going to be absolutely fatal when I was young. Polio, absolutely fatal. No way to cure it. Meningitis, no way to cure it. Absolutely curable. All these things have been incurable. I simply find we can cure it. So I find an absolutely different set of conditions obtaining, and instead of then a pharaoh being informed by grand vizier and everybody else just follows what the whip does, it tells them to do. Then we got the nobles on the knowledge, then we got to a middle class in. Now everybody's in on it. This is a very extraordinary moment. That's really what our being here together is about. That I really feel inspired to do what I'm doing. That our hosts inspired, say, use this equipment to make some recording. We're supposed to be doing what we're doing here. That's what I feel, but the extraordinary reality of our being here together. So thinking about then our function in the universe with this beautiful mind, I want to find a good working example of an analogy at a scale that you and I can comprehend. Because when I talk about an eternally regenerative universe, and of which you and I just in a very short amount of time been able to it's just. I remember when Harlow Shapley first discovers a galaxy. That there are galaxies other than our own. I was fully grown, and suddenly that we have now over 1 billion galaxies, actually photographed them. Incredible thing going on here. Now, trying to, and you and I just can't think. And one reason I showed you last night this picture of this expanding flame phenomena. Do you remember expanding at a rate where just a little over one day, its rate of expansion is the distance between the Earth and the Sun, and yet it looks like it stays absolutely no motion there. So we cannot really get the feeling. Our reflexes are not allowed to participate. If we really could, then we'd burn up if we got in there. That kind of information. So here we are in this extraordinary, beautiful biosphere with the operating conditions, with the great delicacy and balance where you and I then are hydraulically designed and so forth. I want you to think about a complex design accomplished by human beings. And I find the carelessness with which people talk about a Boeing 747. I know I've flown that, they're no good. But a Boeing 747 is a very extraordinary device. And it goes through the sky, through the air, at a velocity equivalent to 10 times the velocity of a hurricane. Now the resistance in the air increases as a second power. So the ferocity, the actual engineering ferocity of interaction of that Boeing 747 with the environment is 100-fold the ferocity of a hurricane that you and I experience it. Just multiply that 100-fold. And yet so superbly designed to stay nice and shiny, and nothing seems to be going on. No trouble. No trouble. But man's been able to understand principle enough really to develop the alloys of those aluminums, using those mass into attractive principles. You get to the point where he really doesn't know what a ring route is. When the Boeing 747 goes, they say it's a little bumpy, fasten your seat belts. It's a pretty big thing there, weighing 200 tons, and you say it's a little bumpy, 200 tons doing this. The fact is when we're going through thermals, and the airs do not move horizontal to the earth, but they're going up and down, positive and negatives like this. We've got enormous columns. You're going through a thermal rising about 100 miles an hour this way, another, or we're going down 200 miles shear effect. It goes very, it's a little bumpy. The actual stresses that are involved are equivalent to taking the Queen Mary over Niagara Falls and saying a little bumpy at breakfast here this morning. The man's been able to handle those kind of forces competently. To really master that much of information, produce it, is incredible to me. Now, he's going to then bring this out of the sky, going to have 150 tons hit the earth at 150 miles an hour. That usually smashes the eggs, all right. But it comes down and there's music all playing, everybody putting on their coat and everybody paying no attention to the incredible capability. Now, that contact is something goes on here. What goes first? The pneumatic tires hit first, distributing the load. And then what happens? We got hydraulic struts, and the enormous pressure on pushing water through an enormous system, using the frictions of the system. We distribute that load. That's the only place where man has really done the design, as nature has done, of designing a tree or a human being with hydraulics, only in the landing gear of that airplane. But by virtue of the hydraulic distribution of the loads and pneumatic distribution of the load, we can do it. Do it in that beautiful way. Now, that Boeing 747 flying through the sky, getting people safely from here to there, up and far, in order to be able to do it, there's almost 1,000 instruments up to the point. And those instruments are showing you, giving you every critical piece of information on that ship, exactly what all the stresses are, what the heats are, what the pressures are. Anything's going to be known to be even mildly critical where there could be any variability. That information comes up on the dials. And alongside of them are usually the second dial, where you can just move something and balance the needle in that one, and automation takes over, where the beautiful metering going on, done by, again, man learning about the invisible kinds of behaviors of atoms that'll give us all kinds of electronic behaviors. So we get this under control. But every once in a while, there's a lack of information coming on in those dials, and the captain, chief pilot, got all this secretary, engineers and pilots, but the captain says, the information not coming in, something has really gone wrong here. So go off automation everywhere. I got to take over manual. And it takes over. And only by virtue, as a human being, having access to principles of the universe, can he save that ship. And very often he does. I would then say, if I were designing an eternally regenerative universe, in contradistinction to a little Boeing on a little planet Earth, an eternally regenerative universe, with absolute integrity, so incredible technology that is operative, I think you would need local instrumentation, getting local sensing of what are the critical informations. And you certainly need locally a monitor, like that pilot outside, who has access to great rules themselves in order to be able to solve critical problems. And I think that's just what we're here for. We're here, and we're just at the point where we can really talk about it this way. It seems to keep merging. That's why we're here. We're meant to use every bit we have of these faculties of apprehending and comprehending and employing principles. That's what we're here for. Now, I want to jump from that to thinking about something I spoke about earlier, humanity then committed to the concept nowhere nearly enough around. This is the non-thinking bureaucracies, great governments and great bureaucracies, and great corporations and great bureaucracies, and there's a struggle in there of we call it in the company politics, bureaucracy politics. See, who's going to get the job? Whose family are going to eat? Whose family is going to be safe? And you know, this is the rules, and you know how the boss thinks about that, and you don't do your thinking. You just say, how do I play it safe? Safe. So I have an enormous number of humanity are in bureaucracy and not thinking. So this thinking capability we have is not being generally employed except by little children. And little children spontaneously start thinking, ask most beautiful questions. And then they get told down, never mind, you better not do that, it's going to get the family in trouble, etc., etc., and they get negative until, but each child is a little less put upon in this manner because the information that is coming in is so absolutely contradictory to the traditional way of looking at things that the older world just can't explain it with conviction anymore. Yeah, you are wrong. And so the child is beginning to think freely. That really is typical of your generation. You are really doing your own. You're not endowed with something that generation before didn't have, but the generation before, I was brought up, my father died when I was very young. My mother said, darling, this man's taking a lot of trouble to talk to you. He's a great friend of your father. And I didn't like what he said. Mother said, never mind what you think. Pay attention to this man. He doesn't know what he's thinking. He's taking a lot of trouble. And I was continually being told, never mind what you think. Pay attention. And I was being sent to the school where they're going to really show me. And so I continually found what I was thinking a little out from what I was being taught. I assumed that I was just a freak. And I have to get on with myself as a freak. So I don't know how many of you really have had to often think that way about yourself, but I guess you had to live with a freak. Now, you're just not being told anymore, never mind what you think. and you had the thinking capability was always there, and just not being discouraged so much. This is my biggest hope that we're going to make it here is that this thinking is being manifested and really employed by the young world. And will it get going fast enough to overcome the inertias in the bureaucracies and the fears operative in those bureaucracies? It's a very touch and go question. Even though I now know that we have the option to make man, I really know how. I know what all the things we have to do design-wise to get there. That we'll do it. I have the slightest idea. But I'm deeply moved as I begin to see one more manifest a little more out for us in the newer freedoms of that young world. Because each child being born is being born in the presence of less misinformation. Each child being born in the presence of a lot more reliable information, and they're paying attention. So they're thinking with very good inputs of data. The operation conditions are very, very much improved all the time, and each child a little better off. I can go at any point, the way I'm talking to the big patterns, I could really digress and get in great detail, as you find me, on structures, for instance, just getting down to the way the tree is designed or whatever it may be. I'm really quite deliberately avoiding going in any depth in these first days. I'm trying to, as I can, to keep out the bigger concepts. And I hope you begin to share with me this concept of the function of human beings. Whether I'm really right or wrong, I have the slightest doubt. Of course I don't know. But it does not seem to be, I don't find any argument against it. And I find it to be very, very good argument for it. So that for the moment I feel I can accept it as a hypothesis that is reasonable, that we are here then as problem solvers and that we're given, particularly in metaphysical problems, to solve in principle. Therefore, we're going to have to get more and more courage to really go along with principles, and have less and less fear of upsetting the tradition and the game, and be less and less afraid of those who are afraid. Now, I'm going to bring in one more a principle that I talked to you about, and this goes back to 1927 in my life when I was 30 years of age, and I'd had, by good fortune, really an acceleration in finding out a great deal about what doesn't work. And I'd really been so enthusiastic about the people who love me and would tell me how to play the game. I tried to play the game, but I was not thinking, I was playing the game. And I learned to play the game very well, but then it came to really head-on crash. So that 1927, we had our second child born, our first child having died 5 years earlier at the age of 4. And the loss of that first child was just an incredibly sad matter. So suddenly a new child entrusted to us, and we were penniless, and I really felt very strongly many of the things you heard me talking about here. I hadn't anywhere nearly the time to make the nice models that we have, but my feelings were pretty strong in pure principle about these things existing. And I felt that quite clearly all my contemporaries had on highest priority in their lives that they had to earn a living. They hoped they might earn it in a way that would be pleasant to them, but pleasant or not, you got to earn a living. That was very hard. Your generation is not overwhelmed that way, but we were really overwhelmed by it to such an extent I didn't have anybody even think of contradicting it. It seemed to be so obvious. It just took us that way. And it began to occur to me that this is really nonsense. What we all ought to be doing is to say, what does my experience teach me needs to be attended to, and if not attended to, humanity will be in great trouble, and if attended to successfully, will bring great advantage to humanity. And what would I need to know more than I already know, other than having enough experience to realize it is so? What more do I need to know in order to do something about it? And what, if I am going to do something about it, what is the nature of what I'm going to do about it? Am I just going to try to tell people it's there? Am I going to try to reform people? And I said, number one, here I am. Fact is, I am absolutely penniless. I have no credit. And I feel and see these things. How do you carry on? I said, it could be that the little individual, human being, really has a very great advantage over great corporations and great states. What can the individual do that this corporation can't do? Corporations are legal entities. They can't do what a human being. Number one, a corporation can't think. Only human beings can think. And I said, only a human being then can really operate on his own. He doesn't have to have anybody say yes or no. If he really thinks and sees that so, he can act like that. And luckily he can. The time again he can save the ship. But boy, he has to go fast. And has to operate in a very enormous confidence and principle. Now, so I said, all right, I see then this earning a living is in the way. And one of the principles, but I was deeply moved by having been in regular Navy, been early flying, so forth, really, of the employment of principles. I really have enormous confidence what you can do with principles. The principle of leverage and they absolutely count on that mass into attraction, whatever it may be. So, I've mentioned to you earlier the fact then that the human life on board of our planet, as mentioned earlier today, concept of man possibly having a very important, really a very central function in the universe as a local monitor of problem solving. And in those terms, assuming that human beings are then necessary, needed, not here just to be pleased or displeased, not to do things just from the viewpoint of the ignorance of little man, but something to do with the great wisdom of an extraordinary integrity of the universe, then assuming then that pattern of human beings being necessary and useful to the universe, and the ability to have them on board, requiring then that they do take on energy and take it on in socially in certain extraordinary ways. We would call indigestion, very coarse, crude words, what really goes on when we put energies inside and what goes on, very routing to glands. We don't know much about this. But the point is that in order to be able to have that carry on, to re-energize us and carry us so forth, we do have to have all this great ecological phenomena. Because we need radiation, we need energy to start off with, and mammals can't take it through the skin. So I've talked about that with you before. Vegetation having to impound the sun radiation, and vegetation having to be rooted. I give you all those reasons. So then with the vegetation all rooted, and incidentally the vegetation rooted there, in the chemical process of the photosynthesis, giving off various gases, making other gases, but giving off gases. And the gases given off by the vegetation would soon occupy the whole of the atmosphere, and the vegetation would be able to carry on anymore because it needs another kind of input gas. Therefore, all the mammals are designed to take in the gases given off by the vegetation and convert it, and we use what we want, and then what we give off is what the vegetation needs. So this incredible reciprocity design that human beings pay no attention to as they begin to open up real estate developments and knock down trees. Nobody's talking about this, the respiratory gas exchange. There's not an end to calculating at all of any town planning or engineers. Nobody. All right, we find then that vegetation rooted. And vegetation being rooted cannot reach other vegetation to procreate. And because it then can't reach it, then we have all the insects, butterflies, extraordinary creatures, worms, crawlers, flyers, swimmers, going back and forth between the vegetation, which do all the energy impounding, and going after something in that vegetation and inadvertently cross-pollinizing. So in order to have the whole thing regenerative, we had to have then all those creatures given chromosomic drives so that honeybee is designed to go after his honey. It goes into one flower after another and inadvertently knocks off pollen. Again, precessionally at 90 degrees. He goes this way and the result is this way. Whether he gets honey or not is absolutely, nature gives him that, so he'll do this little trick. But the honey business is not, the big thing is to regenerate the total system. I find that the human beings being given hunger and thirst and all go after them their honey. And they inadvertently didn't mean to, but we had side effects again, 90 degrees, to make babies over here. So then they got a responsibility, the baby, and also given an urge to look out for that young. So they got the side effects here bothering them a lot, and they got to get out more of that honey. And so they learned then, I can grow peas, and he makes him shoes, and makes more shoes than he can wear, and I can grow more peas than I can eat. We want to exchange. So looking out for these side effect kids here makes an enormous amount of interchanges. So finally we sort of invent a unitary honey called money. So we go money bee. Everybody's always money bee and getting out, earn that living. And inadvertently do some logical things. And because we are so preoccupied with fear, looking out for our young, and really I find primarily the fear of human beings is not for themselves. But human beings are really very brave. It really is for those that they love and that really depend on them. Then they really get very fearful. So we have then this fear in those human beings and doing this. And then they produce guns, and that's not a very good idea. But in producing the gun, they really learn how to develop production capability. So they can produce non-gun, they can produce life support, and they begin to being able to take care of a lot more people. All the great changes, the numbers of people really has been advanced, and the breakdown in the death rate, the enormous increase in longevity, all these things are a consequence of his doing the right things for the wrong reasons, and it's negative. You had to get him going. So I don't find anything fault with any of these things that human beings have done, because I really see nature is in the fulfillment, and that's not the eternal way of carrying on. It is part of the due process of humanity getting to where it can really function here. So then I see that what nature is really doing then is really precession. It is 90 degrees. As I said the other day, the effect of bodies in motion on other bodies in motion is to make them go into orbit and not to fall in. So this sort of going after, you're falling into flowers and so forth, is at that 180 where the big thing's this way. So that's what man called this side effects. That's the main effect, and this is a side effect. I said, what I see is now that nature is trying then to maintain a regenerative system. If then I give up altogether the idea of wasting my time money honey hunting, and I really commit myself to what needs to be done and begin to employ the principles, I may really find, since that's what nature really wants to have happen, I may find that I'll get on. But I can't make bargains and nobody to write in a contract with me. I've got to go on my intuition and my sense of the truth. I've got to really go on my mind, and I've got to continually say, is this as far as I'm supposed to go? I get frustrated. But maybe that's as far as I'm supposed to go with this particular one. What is the next high priority, what ought to attend to. Learning then to move this one and move that one. And I've had to make incredible mistakes, but in 1927, I did deliberately undertake to carry on from there on, forget to speak ever again, earning a living. And I had an absolutely, there's a new child. I assure you that my family, my friends, my wife's friends and family thought I was really an incredibly stupid and treacherous character. But it's not easy to get people to understand. It takes quite a lot of time to understand that precession and to understand the kind of confidence I really had in it. I said, if I can prove that I'm just the right one to prove it. I want to prove what an average, healthy human being can do with the faculties we are all given if he's really disembarrassed this nonsense of earning a living. In view of this sudden accumulation of information, which was very different in my day from what had been in my father's day. I thought we're probably at a critical moment when we're supposed to be behaving differently. So we need to have somebody who is penniless make the experiment, see if you can get on. So that's exactly what it did. That's exactly what it did. When I find myself being introduced to many audiences, because I do really meet thousands of them, and often usually being introduced in very generous ways, being called names like genius. And I hurry to point out that everybody is born genius, and that if there's anything important about me at all is that I am a demonstration of what an average healthy human being can do if he's disembarrassed of the nonsense they have to earn a living and really commits himself to what the universe is trying to do. And I'm now so confident, having been gone through this for almost a half century. And I'll show you that getting on was difficult, but it's a big, slow cycle. And there's no place where you can ever say, I'm being supported now for what I did there. It's completely disconnect. Simply a matter of acting in integrity, and you find somehow or other you get on. There are a set of complete inadvertencies that begin to happen where somebody asks you to give a talk you didn't know they're going to want you to talk, and they have very surprising fun to do it, so that takes care of this particular. You never had, you can't, it's anything but a capitalist kind of game of building up, but just that I find I'm willing to take care of more and more activity. My income has increased and increased through all these years to really quite a large amount to go through our books today, but I spend every bit of it. And I must continually be spending it trying to make judgments that this really might get humanity somewhere. And there are enormous numbers of young people who have very important ideas, and you've learned enough about, is that one that really might get humanity somewhere? So that's the kind of game I live in. Therefore, at this point in my life, I don't feel that I'm being treacherous to a young world when I say you can really forget altogether earning a living, provided you really commit yourself to the other man. If you're doing something that's sort of make you feel good, if you're playing an ego, you would like Mr. Paul, don't do this. You can only do this. You really commit yourself truly, centropically, the idea, and synergetically. It has to be everybody and nobody, and really out and out. Well, I've introduced to you lots of patterns, and I've then tried to explore a principle, and I hope you, I think I've had enough experience with what I'm talking about to say I can now eliminate this as being just a coincidence about this. But I'll tell you, in learning, to be able to say that, I had to make many, many mistakes. Any number of times when I did get cold feet, or somebody else getting cold feet on my behalf said, come over and take this job, and things always went wrong when you went off there. You had to really commit yourself absolutely to the complete deep end, or it doesn't work. So you have to work on an incredible faith in the integrity of our universe. And when I began to have to do my own thinking, the number one question I had to ask myself was the following. I said, you've been taught to believe this and that. Your grandmother loved you to pieces. She told me about somewhere down in Mesopotamia 2,000 years ago. Said, down, you're too young to know, but there's been a relaying of people who do love and do want to be truthful, and this is the way it seems to be. And I said, if I'm going to do my own thing, I got to give up all the beliefs I ever had. And I don't want to be unkindly to my condition reflects towards my mother, my grandmother, or people I really love to pieces. I'm going to have to really question everything, come back to my own experiences, or to the experience of somebody who, it's my experience, is faithful and telling me about his experiences. not what he believes, or what he asked me to believe, but what do we experience? So I said, all right, you have experienced all around you, all around the world, a fervor of human beings, a sense that there are all those churches and synagogues and enormous numbers of human beings who really feel, apparently, that something's going on, there's something operating in the universe a little more important and more competent and more reliable than man. I said, if you're going to do your own, in your own experience, do you have any reason to have to assume there's a greater intellect and integrity operating in the universe than that of man? I said, if we're going to really ask myself that, I'm overwhelmed by it, because I really have learned about leverage. I really have learned the mass attraction. I'm just overwhelmed at this, because it can only be discovered intellectually. It is entirely intellectual. There's quite clearly is a manifest of an extraordinary intellectual integrity operating in the universe. Nothing to do with any shape or form or anything. Complete abstraction. It's just, and that you and I can never quite get to the truth. We can say it a little better, but you don't want that. So you and I know of it, and we can be inspired by it. So I made complete commitment then, back to 37, to this intellectual integrity of the universe. And I said, if I really shoot the works, I don't know very deeply, if you keep your sensitivity, whether you're really on or not on. You're supposed to go this far, but when you stop and go, and what direction you take up. I think this is a very good time to stop tonight. I'll tell you that as we go on, I'm going to get in really quite depth. For instance, I gave you exposure to map. I don't tell you how I designed this map and why it does not have the aberrations and the misinformation and the other methods of projection. I'll be able to show you exactly why it has the least possible deformation. In going from spherical to flat, there is aberration. But this has going again to limit cases, it has the most evenly distributed error, so much so it's absolutely symmetrical. It's just that there is no visible distortion in this map. There is distortion, but I've been able to keep it in magnitudes that are subvisible. I haven't, but principles do. So I'm going to say good night, and I will keep searching, and I didn't know what I was going to say the first time. I haven't known really what I was going to say. I want everybody to realize the reality of this, and I'm sure hope the picture doesn't take out a moment of thinking, because I was thinking very hard in there, and you were thinking hard. That's very much a part of this picture. And I am going to be able then to hold this tapestry together. And now I've said enough so I really begin to see and think about other things that I know, and I will not be quite as slow in introducing them. The things are going to move really very rapidly as we get into details in various areas. I will then get over to this comprehensive anticipatory design science and get into what it is you and I, what I've learned are the strategies that a little individual can employ and how it can be most effective on behalf of his fellow human beings. So, good night.